Sean, I thought we would start with some basic definitions. Could you help me understand how you think about bipolar disorder? What is it, and what maybe it's not?
Okay. Well, and this would go with a wide range of disorders, including schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, even depression to a certain degree. Is these labels are basically a group of symptoms that are coming together. And so when you go to a psychiatrist and you show a number of symptoms, then they give this disorder. All right. But there is no medical basis for this in the sense that there is no exam, a medical exam or MRI or PET scan or blood test of any type to show evidence of schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar disorder, or depression, anything like that. Okay, so but when you get into the symptoms of what's going on, you've kind of got two levels of bipolar disorder, and one is the one most people think about, which is bipolar two, hypomania, and that would be things like a lot of business ideas, nonstop talking, irritability, lack of sleep, shopping sprees, perhaps hypersexuality, and then the other end, depression, totally low energy, feeling like your life's going nowhere, regretting your life decisions, like you don't belong, that kind of thing. So that's the typical manic depression that people think about that usually gets diagnosed as bipolar 2. Bipolar 1 is when those manias, that hypomania, gets more intense and then goes into psychosis. And psychosis is easily defined, I think, as simply a break with reality. And more specifically, you think that you're dreaming or that you're in a kind of a dream world where the world responds to you as if you're dreaming. And then from that place, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. Okay.
Mm. It sounds very similar to how, in particular in Hollywood, the schizophrenia is defined by having this illusionary and hallucinations about what is real. So you're saying that bipolar one is actually quite similar to schizophrenia?
Looking at the history of how these things are discussed,
Mm.
my belief is that currently now what we're calling bipolar 1 in the 1980s would have been referred to as schizophrenia. So for
Right.
example,
Makes
the
sense.
the doc, Dr. Stan Groff, who I studied, he looked at, for example, what he described as a spiritual emergency, which was a highly spiritual kind of psychosis that you can work through quite easily. And it's something that I had in 1996. He compared that to schizophrenia. He didn't refer it
Okay.
to bipolar disorder. But now, when you look at the diagnosis that people are receiving, schizophrenia now seems to be reserved for people who are dealing with a lot of paranoia. Okay. The police are after me. There's cameras everywhere, that kind of thing. And a lot of disturbing hallucinations, like I'm being chased by devils, and people who have no insight into what's going on with them. Usually, when people have bipolar disorder, they know. When people have schizophrenia, they often they think they're perfectly fine. They just have somebody following them everywhere.
Makes sense. Well, kind of.
Yeah.
Um, well, that maybe is a good segue to your book, the Bipolar Awakenings that you released last year. I'm curious what prompted
Right.
writing
I've
a
got it
book, which
right
I
here.
understand is a quite a big undertaking always.
Thanks. Right. Well, I got into this work. The subtitle is The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder. And what happened was, I had had an experience that got me put in the psychiatric hospital in 1996, which had been very, very beneficial for me. It ended 7 years of on again, off again depression. It gave me a sense of new meaning in life. I interacted with people better. My salary tripled at work after I got out of the psychiatric hospital. Okay. And I was never medicated. So it was a very beneficial experience. And I wrote a book about that called Am I Bipolar or Waking Up? But then in 2007, when I was living in Brazil and my wife's nieces had some experience very similar to what I had. And so then I got into this research about, well, what's the difference between what happened to me, which was so beneficial and but misunderstood, and what's going on with them that's being labeled with bipolar disorder. And what I found after was that there was actually a history of pioneering psychologists in the 70s and 80s that had looked at psychosis as actually not an illness, but an intended reorganization of the psyche. All right. And so once I got into their work and talked to countless people online with videos that I made called Am I Bipolar or Waking Up, I realized that there was just this huge gray area between people who are medicated for life and actually need the medications, people who are having genuine breakthroughs in their life that could be best defined as spiritual, and that most people are somewhere falling in between. And so I coined this term bipolar awakening to embrace that paradox, because bipolar tends to be a pejorative, meds for life, you've got an illness, there's no hope for you, awakening, enlightenment, blissful, all that stuff. So I just decided my website needs to be bipolar awakenings to cross that boundary, you know.
Mm. Yeah,
Does that answer your question?
it does. Kind of definitely a big motivation if you've felt the transformation on your side is the kind of helping others maybe see that paradigm shift for them as well, like what actually is
Yeah.
happening inside them.
Yeah, and to try and guide people who are kind of stuck in that gray area where they see the
Mm,
potential of their spiritual experiences like I had, but are medicated, and helping some of those people sort of transition it into a breakthrough as opposed to a breakdown, you know.
mm. When you say spiritual, I mean probably a lot of people, including myself, raised in a kind of atheistic, environment, as growing up, it kind of rings
Okay.
like this immediate like red flag. I'm curious, like how do you define that? Because now as I'm getting older, you broaden your awareness of what it means, and it's maybe not going to equate to religion or something like that. So how do you think about what is spirituality, and also like what it is kind of mechanistically? Is it like a belief system in the brain? Like how do you think about it?
Okay. I see human beings as having an inherent spiritual dimension, like our biology. Okay, you've got a
Hmm.
spiritual dimension. There's a your life force is part of that spiritual dimension, whether you believe in it or not, and it's outside of religious dogma. And that's where things get complicated, because if you're a materialist or a scientist, you know that there are things from the religions that make no sense, they are impossible. Jesus could not have been born of a virgin. He could not have been dead for 3 days and then been resurrected. I stopped being a Catholic in when I was about 20 years old because I just could no longer believe in the resurrection. All right. Then I went into a period of atheism because the orientation of religion is that God is somehow tangible, like in a measurable way, like we just somehow need to be able to find him or see him or touch him or something like that, or touch her, but they're real, you know. It's somehow part of our shared reality, and that if science had the tools, science would be able to find God. That's a religious experience or a perspective. And so from an atheistic perspective, it's like, well, actually, there is no scientific evidence that God exists, because science is about what you can measure, you know? If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And from a scientific perspective, materialist perspective, you cannot measure God. It cannot exist. But you can have experiences in your life that shift that perception and open you up and make you more intuitive and kind of awaken you to a deeper intelligence that's going on, where you have a rational mind. You can see the way people would see things rationally, but then you've got these intuitive feelings that are guiding you in another direction. And the second you start to say, you know what? I'm going to follow my heart on this. I know what I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm going to follow my heart on this. Reality, in a sense, can shift on you, and it can take surprising turns. It's a sense like sort of stepping out of the matrix to a certain degree, you know. And one of the things that happens when people do that is they start to have synchronistic experiences, things that are absolutely impossible if you really sat down and thought about the stories they're sharing. Things like you're thinking about a person, and from halfway around the world, and then they just show up and you meet them. Oh, wow, I was just talking about you, and you thought they were in Australia and they're in Finland, that kind of synchronicity. I had a situation once where I had a dream in October that I saw play out in the beginning of a movie perfectly 8 months into the future. I saw a silhouette of a man falling into a jungle canopy in August, and then the next March, I saw that scene in the beginning of King Kong Skull Island, a movie that had not been made yet. And I don't want to get into the whole story about that, but when things like that happen to you, and it was a very meaningful situation, then all of a sudden you're just like, okay, this is not the world is not as linear as we think, and that this actual quantum dimension, this deeper dimension, actually makes the earth or our life experience look a little bit more like a realm than it does a planet, like a fixed planet. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So just to summarize then, is spirituality is like this intuitive sense that there's more to the reality rather than kind of the material world. Would that be a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, but also I think that spirituality manifests differently in different people
Mm,
depending on their development and where they're at. So if you have a religion, that's your spirituality, and that needs to
yeah.
be respected and validated, right? If you're atheist, paradoxically, that's your spirituality, is that you're atheist, okay? Um, Ken Wilber wrote that he felt that atheists were more further along in the spiritual evolution process than religious people. And why did he believe that? Was that atheists were more open to follow their own soul and make their own choices, whereas religions would restrict people with certain dogmatic beliefs. So that
Mm,
blew my mind to think of an atheist person as actually being more spiritually evolved than a religious person. So, yeah, that was a bit of a mind blower for me.
yeah. Maybe switching gears a bit. My understanding, at least looking through the book, is that a big part of I want to call solution, but big part of the modality of how you actually treat people in a therapy session is breathing exercises. Could you kind of speak more to that and like maybe why breathing and what does it look like?
Okay. And there are a myriad at this point of different breathwork techniques, and they really do have very different intentions. The one I'm dealing with, for example, maybe I should talk within the concept of the most famous right now, I would say, is probably the Wim Hof breathing, which
Sure.
I'm not I do Wim Hof breathing. I don't teach it, but I do it. Wim Hof breathing, you're talking about an aggressive, accelerated breathing with a specific technique. He'll tell you belly, chest, head, this. And then at a certain point, once you're feeling energized, you hold your breath as long as you can. Then you exhale, and then you take a deep breath in and hold for 15 seconds. And it's very structured. All right. And the intentions are basically to reduce inflammation. Right. And Wim Hof has gone and done scientific experiments. He's been measured, and you can see, for example, the alkalinity of your urine will change dramatically after doing Wim Hof breathing. I've done those tests. I've peed on the litmus paper and seen the acidity of my urine go from being extremely acidic to very alkalinic. So this is a scientifically measured thing, right? And it has a strong biological aspect, and that's the intention. There is overlap. Wim Hof has talked about how certain people have had certain emotional breakthroughs during Wim Hof breathing as well. But the focus on holotropic breath work, which is my style, which was developed by Stan Groff, is to help people heal emotional issues, uh, best described as trauma. And how you would see trauma is it's not necessarily something bad that happens to you, it's something that is emotionally impossible to absorb. Okay. So You become traumatized by bad things because there's an emotional pain there you're not ready to accept. And from the Groff, he's a founder of transpersonal psychology, okay, which sort of accepts the human spirit, that the breathing is intended to release that trauma, right? Now, where's the trauma? The trauma is in what he would call bioenergetic blockages in our soul system. You could call it our chakra system or our kundalini system. And there is no scientific way to measure that system, but you can feel it. Because, for example, what put me in the psychiatric hospital, a huge, what felt like explosion of energy at the heart chakra, which brought up trauma related to a scuba diving accident. So you can have these somatic experiences that are actually rooted in what I would call our kundalini, okay? This kundalini energy system, right? Now, when you do breath work, you're breathing your holotropic breath work. You're using your own style of breathing, but you're breathing yourself into a non-ordinary state, which takes about 20 minutes. And in that way, it parallels psychedelic therapy to a certain degree. When you take them, they break down the ego functioning. When you overbreathe for about 20 minutes, that also breaks down your ego functioning. And then you're more in touch with the unconscious. Whatever needs to heal will start to surface. And sometimes it's very clearly related to specific traumas. Like I supported a guy in a session who had bipolar disorder, who had been shot in the face here in Brazil. He had a scar from a bullet wound that went right through his face. Once that was healed, he never had to go back to psychiatric medications again. He was a medical doctor, by the way, that should also add. Um, and so once you get it, the idea is that once you heal enough of this trauma, that you can heal bipolar disorder and other disorders, but that everybody is traumatized to some degree, and that everybody is in a sense on this planet to heal. Even the atheists are here to heal. They just really don't have that orientation, that they're in a different place, you know. Does that make sense?
Hmm. So basically, like breathing for 20 plus minutes, that's dissolving the kind of sense of self in the brain. And that then unlocks these traumas that are held kind of in the body, in different muscles, for example, but basically not probably possible to, as far as we know, possible to detect kind of these blockages with the current methods we
Right.
have. Makes sense. And then basically, when it comes to the actual kind of therapy, then within, is there like guidance in between, or do you kind of almost like allow the inner whatever needs to happen happens, and you're kind of there as a guide to support in the beginning at the end? Curious like about what it looks like, and because I believe in a lot of the holotropic work that other people do, one of the conditions when they say like we're not going to treat you or we're not going to do this with you is a bipolar disorder. So it's quite interesting how like actually
Right.
what you're saying is like it is actually very possible, but you need to maybe adjust it a little bit. Could you talk to that?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator with a company called Groff Transpersonal Training, which was originally founded by Groff. They've had some
Yeah.
political separations, but that's who I was certified with. And bipolar disorder was contraindicated to work with holotropic breathwork because it's typically done in a group setting for a limited time frame. But my mission was to help people with bipolar disorder, and I could see that the technique had potential. So I said
Mm.
to myself, well, why don't I create a retreat process so that they get private attention in a almost unlimited time frame? So I stay with people in private retreats for up to 10 days. 10 days seems to be the maximum amount of time that they can be with me, okay? And then in that frame, the typical holotropic breathwork frame is or structure is a 3-hour session played with powerful music. You've got trained facilitators there, and they don't guide your process at all. And that's one of the unique things about the holotropic principles, is that it's completely unguided, but the facilitators are trained to support you and protect you, give you body work when needed, if you ask, and also what was the other thing? Give you affection if asked too, in a non-sexual way, but to really bring their presence so that the facilitator is actually there and prepared to love you if
Mm.
you request. Okay.
Yeah.
But the whole thing is there's no manipulation to the whole thing at all. Right. But it's a 3 hour structure. And so with my retreats, what I was doing was I would tell clients, following all the principles, but I would say you could stop breathing whenever you want. Okay. So if they wanted to stop after 30 minutes, they could. If anything got too much for them, we could stop, and we would also resume whenever they want. So instead of having, for example, on a Groff training module, during a week long session, I would personally be doing holotropic breathwork for myself in 2 3 hour sessions in 1 week. Okay. On my retreats, we allowing clients to do what they wanted. We were breathing every day of a 10-day retreat, but usually for shorter periods between 30 minutes and an hour. And when I told the holotropic breathwork facilitators that I was
Mm.
working with people who had a history of psychosis, taking them into non-ordinary states 10 times in 10 days, their jaws would just hit the floor, because there was always the risk that the more breathwork you do, the more risk of psychosis could come up because you're spending more time in the non-ordinary state. But that's not the case. What happens is the breathwork grounds you, you know, and the more grounded you become, the less likely you are to go into psychosis.
Yeah. It seems like in the last few years, there's been this surge of interest in these kind of, let's call them alternative pathways to therapy. As you mentioned, psychedelics has been like recently much more studied in the US, UK, and elsewhere.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it seems like when it comes to breath work, it's pretty nascent. And I'm curious, based on everything you've done on your like practical experience, how do you think about the design study if we were to, together as like, fund in the future something where we look into how does breathing and particularly this type of breath work could be an intervention for a subset, at least, of people that have a bipolar disorder. How would you think about designing the study to provide maybe evidence that, for the mainstream community and scientific community and also psychiatrists that, hey, that is both safe and effective?
Yeah, and it's very challenging because, the hard science is you've got to have things that are measurable. We're
Yes.
talking about how people feel, and that's not measurable. You can make subjective studies and tick
Mm.
some boxes about how a person feels, but that's about it. And also the healing process can be a little bit unpredictable. So, for example, when people work with me in their first retreat, their actual processes tend to be quite mild. There's not a lot of movement because typically in holotropic breathwork sessions, people aggressively breathe and
Hmm.
then they work it out physically on a mat with this powerful music. There's a lot of moving around, there's a lot of vocalization, there's a lot of powerful emotions. When I work with people with bipolar disorder, actually in the first retreat, they're very quiet. And part of it is their inexperience with the technique. Part of it is that their bioenergetic system seems to be rebuilding itself or being reconnected, mending those blockages to a certain degree, you know. Then in the second retreat we do, they get a lot more emotional, you know. So,
Mm.
in the bigger picture, I mean, you could be looking at um, was a person able to reduce their psychiatric medication after 2 years, you know. That I think that would be if you gave them unlimited access to the breath work, and that's important because everybody has different processes. But
Mm.
boy, if you could give them unlimited access to a similar technique to holotropic breath work for 2 years and then see where they were at. Oh, on, for example, various wellness scales, and there are a number of wellness scales, and you feel connected to the world. You feel like your life has meaning.
Yeah.
How do you feel about wanting to kill yourself? Do you feel more alive? People with bipolar disorder, for example, tend to have addictions for coffee and energy drinks, you know,
Hmm.
because they feel dead inside, you know, um, and can have comorbidity with, for example, marijuana, which is a big trigger. Why
Right.
why are they so prone to drug addiction? Well, sometimes they just feel dead inside, and the roots of that can go right back into the birth process. So there are ways to test, but
Hmm.
the challenge will be it won't be that much more scientifically valid than any other psychological therapy. You know, they're hard to
Yeah.
measure. They're just difficult to measure from a scientific perspective
Yeah.
because it's
No, I've
subjective.
heard. Same, I guess, one of the most evidence-based methodologies, like, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But even there, as you mentioned, it's like mostly a subjective measurement of improvement in those markers of well-being when it comes to depression, anxiety. Not that I'm expert there, but I wonder, like, in depression, I remember reading somewhere that there are
Well,
some
and if I could
neurological.
just
Yeah, please.
if I could just say something before you go on, and the paradox, the irony is that CBT isn't particularly effective. People talk about their issues, but it doesn't move the needle that much. But because it fits into that kind of medical box, it's
Hmm.
okay. This is the thing that works, and because it ticks a lot of the scientific boxes, people think it's effective. It's not that effective.
Hmm.
Talking to people over the years, you know, holotropic breathwork is much more effective than CBT, and there's no comparison. Absolutely no
Hmm.
comparison. But go
I
ahead.
think it's also
Yeah.
one of the most studied methodologies, as you mentioned, because it fits the box. You can study it fairly
Yeah.
rigorously and get some kind of meta-analysis across a number of people and get a pretty statistically significant result. But I guess with
Mhm.
holotropic, it's pretty hard to do like a placebo-controlled, randomized controlled study on
There's
it.
no
But
placebo. There,
exactly,
there.
you
You
can't do
can't.
it.
You can't have it. Yeah, and as a facilitator, you need to be emotionally invested in the success of your client. Right.
Yeah.
You have to
But I guess the
be
same is
there
true
for them.
for the psychedelics, right? There is a placebo, but they still manage to look at some of the impact of that
Right.
objectively. So maybe there's hope there.
Yeah.
Maybe switching
Yeah.
gears
You
a
would
bit, you
probably
mentioned
measure
the.
holotropic. You'd
Sorry?
probably do a holotropic study similar to a psychedelic study, I would think.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, switching gears a little bit, you mentioned the emotionality, like being. I remember reading in your work about kind of the suppression of emotions being one of the, you know, difficult things when it comes to trying to kind of re-energized and find yourself. And I would imagine, like, if you think about the corporate side, we almost by default suppress emotions. And many people probably listening as well come from that side of the world, like where they the workplace. And I'm just curious to hear, what have you learned about kind of emotional work in the corporate side, in the workplace, like any advice you have for leaders or just people in the workplace of how to best deal with their emotional side.
Right. Good question. And I started out, I'm 59 now. And when I was in my 20s, I was in advertising. And part of being professional meant you just kept your emotions in check. You know,
Yeah.
your boss tells you to do something, you say, okay, and you be professional and that's it. And you do need appropriate emotional expression for sure, for sure. One of the jokes I had with um, when I went for my holotropic breathwork training is you never asked one of these people, how are you? Who are people are getting trained. You never said, how are you? Unless you were prepared for a good 15-minute answer. Because if you're at work and someone says, how are you? What do you say? You say, I'm good. Thanks. You know, your house could be on fire. Your kids could be, kidnapped, but at work, you're good. Right. Transpersonal psychologist. Oh, I woke up this morning. I had this dream about my mother and I had this sense of abandonment. And um, these people are connoisseurs of emotions. Their world is very emotional, and I think it's untenable in a business world to be that in touch with your emotion. Well, not to be that in touch, but to be that expressive, right? But I do think that there is an overlap with creativity, and even it can create better relationships at work if people did a little bit more emotional work on themselves, got a little more cognizant of their own issues, so that you could have meetings where I could come into your room and say, you know, I'll confess, Patrick, when you said that I'm not going to be part of that meeting, I felt like shit. Instead of me saying to you, oh, no, it's fine. It's fine. See what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
and one of the things they've learned about this was a study on people who had a spiritual but non-religious orientation. Okay. In business interactions, people with a spiritual non-religious orientation don't see the interaction, the conversation, the meeting, or between a student and a teacher, for example, as transactional. They see it as relational. So people will, if they have a spiritual orientation, they will spend more time and be more emotionally invested in the conversation than a person with more of a business perspective, where you can really feel like you're being rushed out of the room. You know, time is money. What do you got? You know, I've had a lot of meetings with my bosses. You go into their office, you sit down, they say, "What do you got for me?" That's even before hello is, "What do you got for me?" And then you give them your 10 minutes, thanks, goodbye. Out the door you go. You know, that was Las Vegas. That was about as tough an environment you could get. That's when I worked in advertising. But, you know, it can really be tough in a business environment. And I think the more humanity we can bring into a business world, the better off we're going to be.
Hmm. Maybe before we start closing, would love to move a little bit more esoteric realm, which I know you've worked on, and I think in the book as well, you mentioned this interesting framework around having like the modalities and contributions that they have. So I think you had like the psychiatry was the around kind of physiological contribution, and then you had the
Right.
psychology as the intellectual, peer support, from your friends, family as emotional, and then the last one
Emotional.
was shamanic, was the spiritual contributor. Could you,
Right.
I think the word shamanic, like we have this image of like an Indian shaman or something where they're like speaking to spirits and trying to get rain to fall down. Like, what is
Right.
the modern like version of that, and how do you even define that, like the shamanism in the current state of the world, and what's the contribution towards the work you do?
Yeah. Well, I guess in a very simple way, I would just describe shamanism as a intimate relationship with spirit. I would put it like that. So that you don't
Mm,
need to go through a priest, for example, or you don't need to follow a particular dogma. You've got your own relationship with that non-ordinary state. But it can be interpreted in what I think of as three major or very different ways. Okay. And I talk about it in one of my chapters of my book. And it depends on your level of development. So, for example, in tribes, the shamans are actually very materialistic in a particular way. Their work is to make it rain, it's to bring a good birth, it's to win a battle, it's to eliminate a sickness. It's not about personal development. And it's very superstitious in a sense. For example, if twins are born in some tribes, the association, and this is tribes in the Amazon and in other parts of the world as well, often twins are killed because they believe that only an animal can give multiple births. Okay. So they'll kill them. And how they'll kill them in one particular tribe in the Amazon is they will bury the children alive under the ground so that their spirits do not come back and haunt the tribe. Okay. So this is a very supernatural orientation that sometimes has deadly consequences. Extremely ritualistic, but it's not our place to judge because these tribes have survived for thousands of years. And so there's something about what they're doing that is helping them stay intact. And that kind of orientation is found all around the world. It's pervasive. All right. How we come back to shamanism in what I would call a postmodern orientation is from more of a diversity aspect. So I would call this the postmodern shamanism. We go back to these tribes, early civilizations. We find parts that are kind of interesting to us and we kind of adopt them, but only bringing up what we think of as sort of positive or beneficial and for our personal development. So the whole New Age movement is often centered around what I would call a postmodern shamanism, right? But there's a lot of culture that's borrowed from native peoples around the world. You'll see people doing the sweat lodges. They've got their feathers, they've got their special songs. these are all remnants of tribal cultures, you know, songs, music, clothes, and sometimes taboos about, oh, what you can't do and what you can do, this sort of thing. So that would be postmodern shamanism. And then what I would call a stage 8 advanced quantum shamanism is when where you realize that, look, this shamanic aspect, it's almost like humans have an internet connection that we haven't realized yet. And all you need to do to connect with spirit authentically is get your yoga mat and lay down, you know, put your sweatpants on, get your yoga mat out and get to work. And once you've had enough experience, you don't need a particular technique. You don't need music. You don't need anything. You know what you're looking for. It becomes almost as easy as clicking on the internet on your computer. You know, in the 80s, we wouldn't know what you're talking about, but now it's just a way of life. We don't even think about it, right? So I see that sort of quantum shamanic aspect as something that we've all got. We just haven't all been able to activate yet. And part of what that means as well is that we can take on the healing, or we can take on the unconscious pain and unconscious energies of other people, um, only by being empathetic. There can be no ego involved, but the healing field, like this higher intelligence that really is the healing agent in holotropic breathwork, can share that information with other people that are in the room or even not in the room, because I do this work at a distance at this point. And how you'll know is that there will be psychic information that's conveyed. From a scientific perspective, some people think that psychic experiences simply do not exist, that they're all a figment of your imagination. But psychic information is something that comes to me frequently. So, just to give one simple example of how it can come, um, with a client I worked with a few weeks ago, I had a dream that I had a my wife on sitting on my lap, nibbling on my earlobe, and I had a girlfriend watching, and who was hurt by what I was doing. Now, think about it. This makes no sense. If I'm going to have somebody's going to be hurt, it's going to be my wife, and it's going to be a girlfriend that's nibbling on my earlobe. This was the opposite. This tells me this is not my material, because this makes no sense to my life or anything like that, right? I called the woman. I said what happened. It turned out that she had had a lover while she was married who loved having his earlobes nibbled. And that's what that whole dream was all about. All right. So immediately she grasped the synchronicity of the whole thing and knew that I was working on her material.
Hmm.
Okay. So I'll just leave it at that. And I could go on with these kind of stories for a 10-hour
Yeah.
podcast.
I guess might be worth mentioning. You do have a podcast, so people can check it out. There probably is more
Yeah, I
material
do. I do.
they can review. Yeah, I think just to be fully transparent, there's a part of me that is like open to the idea that there's a lot that we don't know, and that we should be open to
Mhm,
at least investigating, but also like
mhm,
that we should be grounded in like there is a reality out there and that it can be investigated. There's like questions that can be answered. We just might not have the tools yet. And I believe even like as you mentioned the like having telepathy and so forth. There, more and more there's discussion like in the popular culture with telepathy tapes and otherwise, like where people like, serious scientists are actually looking into it. I don't think we have any answers
mhm.
yet on like what could be, how could it could be explained because the probabilities there around like, hey, this is just a fluke or the like, it's randomness, for example, as an explanation. It's statistically is very unlikely, at least in some of those scenarios. But again, I'm just open to the fact that A, definitely might not be the case, or B, that there was just a lot of things we don't know as humanity yet.
Right. And I think that, like, when I was an atheist, what brought me out of atheism was, first of all, I was deeply unhappy. Um, I was in a depression at that point.
Hmm.
And I finally made a few moves that were just coming from the heart and not rational at all. I quit my job and I moved to Vancouver. I had no money. I had no contacts in Vancouver. And I just decided I'm leaving. And the minute I made that decision, my depression ended, my life got a lot easier, and I had just an unbelievable sequence of synchronicities that ended up it was one of the most pivotal moves I ever made. So I would say if you are thinking about these things out there and you do see yourself as having an atheistic perspective, you might want to just put your rational thinking aside for the weekend or for a few days. It's going to be there and you're going to come back to it. But to sort of give the other part, to give your intuitive life a chance, you're going
Yeah.
to kind of have to override the rational thinking for a while, you know. But but then once you're comfortable with that intuitive side, then your rational can come back a little bit more, you know.
Yeah. That makes
So
sense. There's
you
a
never lose it entirely.
exactly. You might know this book by Ian McGilchrist, Master and His Emissary, which speaks to the different hemispheres of the brain, and he goes in quite a deep, partly philosophical kind of tirade around how we're so centered around the rational side of our brain, like the language oriented and so forth, that we've almost forgotten that actually it's the other side of the brain, which not maybe should is the strong word, but like tends to be the master, and the culture that we live in is actually made us the opposite in that the contextual and the like the wise part of the brain is usually downgraded. And if it's not like, if you can't break it apart into parts, then it becomes not meaningful. So I'm definitely like, the like I respect that perspective that there is this like, as you mentioned, like intuitive part of us that is often wiser and understands the contextual parts of different things. And I just don't see like why, even though that is, you might not be able to put language on it because language is a very limited tool as is.
Mhm,
Why could it
mhm,
not be based in reality, right? So that's like maybe a slight separation there, if that makes sense.
mhm.
Maybe as a
Why what can't be part of reality? The intuitive side? Is that what you said?
no. So that's what I'm saying is like it felt like when you were describing the kind of the decision to move, for example, it was based on the wisdom of
Right.
your intuition, right? Like you had this feeling like you need
Mhm,
to override your rationality. Like
mhm.
let's say the rational part of the brain, which is like, no, doesn't make any sense. And you just felt like that was the right
Right.
thing to do. And I completely get that. As I mentioned, I think I buy the idea that there's this intuitive sense which is processing like it's processing much more information much faster than the kind of more cognitive, prefrontal cortex is ever
Right.
able to. Um, and yet, what I'm maybe not seeing is how that needs to be separate from the reality we live in, right? So in like the material world, that can be still explained and even like, reviewed and diagnosed, with tools we have in our disposal, with like
Mm.
electricity in the brain. You know what I mean?
Sure. Well, there is a one sort of funny part to the whole thing, which is another reason there isn't a whole lot of good research on this kind of work
Mm,
is that once you're really into this sort of paradigm, it's a different worldview.
yeah,
Most people with this paradigm, they lose interest in scientific research. They're like, well,
it
from their
works.
perspective, it's like, it doesn't matter. It works for me. You know,
Yeah,
try it.
that
Does it
makes
work for
sense.
you? Oh, if it works for you. And you're the judge. And this is a big difference between rational, atheistic thinking and spiritual, non-religious or transpersonal thinking, I would call it, is that there is an emphasis in atheism on objective truth,
Hmm.
facts, right?
Yeah.
With the spiritual, non religious, or transpersonal orientation, there is also a recognition of subjective truth, that what I'm feeling is also true. It's not the same as objective truth, but it's true for
Hmm.
me. You know, most people get that stuff mixed up one way or the other. You could think, your objective truth is subjective or vice versa, but most people don't have a good grasp on the difference between the two. But with this transpersonal, there's definitely an emphasis on subjective truth. And there, it doesn't matter what the research says. It's just if it works for me, it's good,
Yeah, it's beautiful insights.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
if it works, then who cares? I mean, that's
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
with when it comes to in mind. If it works there, I guess if you like have I don't know, like a physiological thing, which is like a disease or something. That what works doesn't is ultimately a question of whether you actually that physiological part is healing or not. That's a statement of truth, right? Where there's like either it's getting better or it's not. If it's not getting better, no matter how you feel about it, it might kill you still, right? It might still end up being lethal. No matter how you're going to feel about it, there's like an objectivity there. But when it comes to mind, in a way, like as we discussed in the very early on, if you feel better, it is almost by definition then working to some extent.
Yeah, to a certain degree, in the I would say in the long, excuse me, in the long term,
Mm,
in the long term, because even going back to Freud, you can go through parts of healing that are extremely painful. So,
right.
you know, if you catch me on a day where I've got infantile traumas surfacing, well, how are you feeling? Awful. I want to,
Yeah.
I'm just in a hell. Oh, well, then it's not working. Well, it's things have come up, so it gets complicated. It's really hard, I think, that to fit the idea of healing into the materialist paradigm, you know. And I've had psychiatrists who've said, well, this is how we see things, and so if you can change your language to go into how we see things, it could be easier. But it's like, but the way you see things is based on certain principles, certain fundamental assumptions, and my work questions those very assumptions, you know. S- that's what's tough. So for a psychiatrist, if you can get a person back to work within 2 weeks with the medications, that's a huge success. Out of the psychiatric hospital and into the workforce in 2 weeks with a few medications is a miracle, and that's great. Sometimes it's needed, often it's needed, but if the underlying issues are just still sitting there and you've got this person going to work and they're just a robot and they're going through the motions of their life and they're never going to reach their full potential, was it really a success? I'd rather have the person stay with me, go through a fucking hell for 2 months, and then get them into a whole new career. That to me would be a great success, if assuming that their career wasn't really what they wanted to be in.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you, Sean. Maybe to finish off, I'm curious. You've still doing retreats. You had the podcast, the book now. What's next? What are you most excited, passionate about right now?
Well, funny enough, and interesting you're asking me that question. It's been 18 years. My book, Bipolar Awakenings, The Quest to Heal Bipolar Disorder, documents 18 years of doing this work. And all the time I was thinking about, well, I got to make a career out of this somehow because it's been a big financial sacrifice. But really, the work has been about research and development, you know. And now everything's like I've done the research to a certain degree, and I just keep going with the work, but my focus is now more on getting the word out. So what's next for me is more podcasts. I'm feeling good about doing more podcasts, speaking to audiences of 10 or audiences of 10,000. Doesn't matter to me. If I can get in front of people, that's what I want to be doing right now, and it feels good. It feels like a new phase for me, which is really
Mm,
nice because I'm not going to change the world doing 15 retreats a year. That's only one person. That's 15 people. That's not enough. I'm looking for total cultural change. And so I think that more interviews is a way to do that.
yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, the reason we
Yeah.
call this the art and science of breathing is it feels like I do believe that this scientific method is the right way to understand the reality and like investigate it and ultimately form my beliefs about what is true and what to recommend to people. But then ultimately on the art side, you kind of come up with ideas of what to even test. It's kind of this intuition and also there's like thousands of years of wisdom and practice that is passed down from generations that has not been investigated at all. So it's like this combination of two worlds, the art and the science of, in this case, breathing, that we're trying to capture. And I think, yeah, although I think we did cover some of the science as well underneath what you're working on, we definitely were a lot on the art side. And then I think it's question is how do we, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, like if we want to educate the audience and the mainstream public, is how do we move that in the language and the in the methods of science, so that it becomes like a serious methodology that a psychiatrist could actually consider for people that are struggling, and it could be helpful for them.
Sure, and I think that part of that means we don't abandon science, but we understand the limits of science, and that science doesn't have much access to our interior subjective realm, you know?
Yeah,
That's a big part of it. So, but for example, on my retreats, I don't bring any religious culture of any kind. And what does that do? Does it make me atheistic? No. It makes it a space for I'm able to help people with a background of any religion, Muslim, Jewish, atheistic. I've worked with people from all religious faiths, but the only reason I can do that is because I don't bring any religious culture or atheistic culture into the work. I just bring the functional aspect, you know,
yeah,
bring the yoga mat, the sweatpants. You're not allowed to wear any jewelry. This is a good example. You don't wear jewelry. Why don't you wear jewelry? Is it a religious thing? Is it a spirit? Do the gods not want you to wear jewelry? No, no. It's because if you're moving around, you can hurt yourself. You could cut yourself if you're wearing sharp jewelry or zippers and that kind of thing. So it's all very functional. And I think that once we have a deep understanding of our spiritual dimension, it becomes a functional issue more than anything else. Does this work? Is this helping? Can we do it? These are the questions we want to be answering, right?
awesome. Well,
Yeah.
Sean, thank you for having this conversation. It's been definitely eye opening in many ways, and also for the work you do. I think I'm sure there's many people that have been diagnosed, as you mentioned, with this incurable disease that maybe can almost like rethink what they have, and could it be actually in some ways at least a positive thing or somehow helpful. So thank you for the work you do. Thank you for being here, and for everyone listening, thank you for tuning in today.
Yeah, and I would also just before we go, and thank you, but I would
Please.
say to people that if they've heard me speaking about this, not to abandon your medication. And when I work with people on retreats or any kind of work I do with them, I ask them to remain on their medication until we felt a shift. And we could talk about that another day, but you should remain on your
Yeah.
medication until deep healing has happened. Okay, because you can get
Yeah,
into
good
trouble.
point. We're not giving medical advice here on on these things, so
No, no.
it's
Nobody
a
wants
very
to end up
important
back in the
point.
hospital, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, man.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Take
me.
care.